The rain tasted of ozone and regret. Elian pressed his forehead against the chilled plasteel of the window, the condensation a cool balm against his feverish skin. Outside, the city bled neon into the perpetual twilight, a lattice of light and shadow that promised everything and concealed even more. Each crimson slash of a passing transport, each cerulean glow from a corporate spire, was a nerve ending in the sprawling organism he now hid from. He was a ghost in its veins, a phantom haunting the forgotten capillaries of the undergrid. Below, in the slick, dark canyons between buildings, sentinel drones drifted like metallic predators, their searchlight eyes cutting cones of sterile white through the downpour. They were hunting. They were hunting for him. His breath fogged a small circle on the window, a transient veil against the city's relentless gaze. He watched it shrink and vanish, just as he was trying to. The ache in his chest was a constant, a dull throb where a connection had been severed. It was not a clean cut. It was a tearing, a violent ripping of threads that left phantom limbs and echoed sensations. Sometimes, when the silence in his small, borrowed room became too absolute, he could almost feel the ghost of another's heartbeat next to his own. He could almost smell the scent that was not his, cool, sharp, like winter air on polished steel, with an undercurrent of something deeply organic, like storm-charged earth. It was a scent that promised order and commanded dominion. Kalen's scent. A shiver, unrelated to the cold, traced a path down his spine. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a man who had made an impossible choice, and the consequences of that choice were now rewriting the city's operational protocols. The newsfeed flickering on a datapad in the corner of the room told the story in cold, sanitized language. Director Vance of Civic Security enacts sector-wide integrity sweeps. Citing potential systemic vulnerabilities, the director has authorized enhanced biosignature, monitoring, and kinetic checkpoints. Public cooperation is mandated. They called it an integrity sweep. Elian called it a manhunt. He knew the true nature of the systemic vulnerability. It wasn't in the city's code. It was in Kalen Vance's blood, a gaping wound in his alpha instincts where an Omega's acceptance should have been. A bond rejected. Elian had stood before him in the sterile luminescence of the director's office, the city a glittering tapestry of control far below them. And he had said the words, "I cannot." He had watched the control in Kalen's eyes, that legendary, unshakable composure that had built this city's security architecture, fracture into 1,000 microscopic fissures. It was not anger he saw, not then. It was a profound, chilling stillness. A system crash. He had done it to save him, to preserve the cold, magnificent edifice of Kalen's life and career from the one thing it couldn't withstand, a vulnerability, an Omega, a bond that the Ascendancy Council would have used as a leash, a weakness to exploit, a reason to deny him the seat he had earned. Elian had seen the political schematics, the data ghosts of conversations he was never meant to access. He knew they would have used him to break Kalen. So he had broken the bond first. He had chosen to become a ghost, to erase himself from the equation, believing the system would eventually rebalance. He had underestimated the chaos of a variable he had never truly understood, the primal, possessive heart of the man he had left behind. Now, that man was using the very system of control Elian had sought to protect, not to maintain order, but to satisfy a singular, obsessive need. He was tearing his own creation apart, not with bombs or violence, but with the quiet, suffocating pressure of absolute surveillance. He was looking for a ghost, and he was willing to choke the entire city to find him. Elian traced a drop of rain as it slid down the window, a slow, solitary tear on the face of the world. He was so very tired of running. The room was a cage of concrete and borrowed time, its air thick with the smell of damp earth and his own suppressed scent, a cloying, sweet fragrance of rain-soaked petals, an anxiety that he fought daily to neutralize with inhibitors. They were failing. His heat was close, a low, simmering fire licking at the edges of his control. Soon, the scent would be a beacon, and the drones would descend. He closed his eyes, and against the darkness of his eyelids, he saw Kalen's face. Not the director, but the man, the one who had looked at him across a dusty archive of forgotten data scrolls, his gaze holding not assessment, but a startling, unnerving recognition. The phantom heartbeat in his chest pulsed once, a painful, lonely rhythm in the rain-drenched silence. The hunt was on, and the monster at its heart was the man he had tried to save. The city was a circuit board, and Kalen Vance was its god. From his office on the 100th floor of the Bastion, he watched the flow of data as a river of pure, cold light. Every transport, every citizen's biometric signature, every transaction, every communication, it all streamed into his private terminal, rendered as elegant, flowing lines of code. He had built this system. He had designed its logic, its flawless predictability. He had made the city safe by making it known. Every variable was accounted for, every contingency planned. Except one, a ghost in his machine, a statistical anomaly that had ripped a hole in his own biological code. The air in his office was filtered to a sterile perfection, the temperature maintained at a constant, cool 18 degrees Celsius. Yet he could smell him. It was impossible. A phantom of sensory input, a glitch in his own neurology, the scent of rain-soaked petals, and something achingly sweet, a fragrance that clung to the airless spaces between his thoughts. Elian. The name was a piece of shrapnel embedded in his consciousness. His fingers moved across the holographic interface, the light cool against his skin. He was not searching. He was dissecting. He amplified the sensitivity of the atmospheric scent analyzers in Sector Gamma 7, cross-referencing their readings with thermal imaging from the Sentinel drones. Nothing. For 3 weeks, nothing. Just the lingering, maddening echo of a scent that was fading from the world and from his memory. A muscle in his jaw clenched. The bond, the one that had been offered and then snatched away, was a raw, open wound. It manifested as a physical hollowness, a constant, low-grade nausea, and a primal rage that was utterly alien to his nature. Control was the core of his being. He controlled the city. He controlled his subordinates. He controlled himself. But this was a corruption in his own source code. He was losing precision. His commands were becoming sharper, his tolerance for failure non-existent. His second-in-command, Marcus, stood at a respectful distance, his posture a study in military stillness. "Director," Marcus said, his voice even, betraying no judgment. "The Council has logged a formal inquiry regarding the indefinite nature of the integrity sweeps. They cite disruptions to commerce and civic liberty." Kalen did not turn from the data stream. Civic liberty is a theoretical concept. Security is a quantifiable reality. Inform the Council that the sweeps will continue until the systemic vulnerability is neutralized. "And the nature of this vulnerability?" Marcus asked, his tone carefully neutral. Kalen's fingers paused over the interface. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Marcus had been with him for a decade. He was loyal, he was efficient, but he could not possibly comprehend the nature of this particular system failure. It was not logical, it was biological. It was the howl of an alpha whose omega had vanished into thin air. "It is a security matter, Commander," Kalen said, his voice flat, a wall of ice. "That is all you and the Council need to know." He could feel Marcus's gaze on his back, could sense the flicker of concern behind the man's disciplined facade. He knew what they were whispering in the lower levels, that the director was becoming unstable, that his obsession with this phantom threat was a sign of stress-induced paranoia. Let them whisper. Their opinions were irrelevant data points. All that mattered was the signal in the noise, the one biosignature that had slipped through his perfect net. He swiped a hand, and a new window opened. A personnel file. Elian Thorne. Classification, Omega. Former position, Junior Archivist, Municipal Athenaeum. Last known location, Sector Beta 4, 3 weeks ago. Attached was a security still, a candid shot of Elian looking up from a datapad, a small, thoughtful frown on his face. His eyes were the color of moss after a storm, and his features were fine, delicate, but held a quiet strength that the camera had somehow captured. Kalen stared at the image. This was the variable. This was the flaw in his world. The archivist who spoke of history not as a collection of facts, but as a living, breathing entity. The Omega whose scent had cut through the sterile air of their first meeting and triggered a cascade failure in Kalen's legendary control. He remembered the moment in the archives, the low light, the smell of old paper and ozone from the servers. He had been there for a data retrieval, a routine matter. And then he had seen him. Elian had turned, and their eyes had met. It was not a spark. It was the silent, sudden connection of two terminals finally finding the correct handshake protocol. A recognition so deep, so primal, it had bypassed logic entirely. The bond had flared into existence between them, an invisible, incandescent thread of pure potential. And for a few short weeks, the world had made a terrifying kind of sense. The city was no longer just a system to be managed. It was the world that held Elian. His work was no longer about control. It was about creating a sanctuary. Then came the rejection, the quiet, devastating denial in his office. "I cannot." The words were a virus that had corrupted everything. Kalen zoomed in on the image, on the soft curve of Elian's mouth. He had done this for a reason. Elian was not impulsive. He was methodical, intelligent. There was a logic to his actions that Kalen could not yet compute. The rejection was not an act of malice. It was a calculated move. But for what purpose? To protect whom? From what? The questions were a feedback loop driving him toward a single, unavoidable conclusion. He had to find him. He had to have the answer. He would rerun the simulation until the variable was solved. He turned to Marcus, his eyes cold and clear as glass. "Divert all available Sentinel units to the undergrid access points in Sector Gamma. Seal the transit hubs. I want a full biometric scan of every inhabitant in the sub-level warrens. Every single one." Marcus's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Sir, that's over 1 million people. The resources are mine to command," Kalen finished, his voice dangerously soft. "Find him, Marcus, or I will burn that sector down to its foundations and sift through the ashes myself." The threat was not an outburst. It was a statement of fact. a calculated promise. He turned back to the window, to the river of light that was his city, his kingdom, his hunting ground. Somewhere down there, a single heartbeat was out of sync with the rhythm he had created. He would find it. He would correct it. He would restore order. The phantom scent of rain and petals filled his lungs, and for the first time in his life, Kalen Vance understood the terrifying, exhilarating logic of chaos. The memory was a sliver of warmth in the encroaching cold. It came to Elian in the quiet hours before the city's simulated dawn, when the hum of the recycler was the only sound. The Athenaeum, a place of silence and dust motes dancing in the shafts of engineered sunlight that pierced the cavernous main hall. He had loved it there. It was a sanctuary from the city's relentless pace, a haven of forgotten stories and discarded truths. He had been cataloging pre-unification data scrolls, their magnetic surfaces fragile and temperamental, when the director of civic security had arrived. The air had changed before Elian even saw him. The atmosphere in the hall, usually still and heavy with the scent of aged paper and ionized dust, had suddenly become charged, electric. A presence had entered the room, a center of gravity so powerful it seemed to bend the light around it. Then the scent had reached him, steel and winter and storm-charged earth. It was clean, absolute, and commanding. It was an alpha scent of such purity and potency that it had silenced every other smell in the vast space. His own Omega instincts, long dormant and suppressed by mild inhibitors, had stirred. A deep cellular recognition. He had looked up from his console, his breath catching in his throat. Kalen Vance was not as he appeared on the public news feeds, a severe, remote figure in a tailored uniform. In person, his presence was overwhelming. He was tall, built with a lean, efficient strength, and moved with a predatory grace that was utterly at odds with the silent, dusty repository. But it was his eyes that had held Elian captive. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and piercing, and they were fixed on him. Not with the detached assessment of a superior officer, but with the focused, unwavering intensity of a navigator who had just found his pole star. "Archivist Thorn," he had said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, yet it vibrated through the floor and up into Elian's bones. He remembered standing, his movements feeling clumsy, disconnected. "Director, I wasn't aware you were scheduled for a visit." "I was not," Kalen had replied, his gaze sweeping over Elian, a silent inventory that felt both invasive and deeply affirming. "I was retrieving a file. It appears I have found a complication." The subtext was a palpable force between them. The complication was not in the archives. It was standing right in front of him. In the weeks that followed, the director's visits became a quiet routine. He would appear under the pretext of consulting historical security protocols, and they would talk for hours amidst the silent stacks. He never spoke of his work, of the city he commanded. Instead, he asked Elian about his, about the patterns of history, the rise and fall of ideologies, the way a single, forgotten event could ripple through centuries. He listened with an intensity that made Elian feel as though he were the most important data stream in the entire city, and Elian, in turn, found himself speaking with a freedom he hadn't known he possessed. He saw the brilliant, systematic mind behind the director's cold facade. He saw a man who craved order because he understood the terrifying depths of chaos. He saw a loneliness in him that mirrored his own. The bond grew between them, not in a rush of primal passion, but in the quiet spaces, in shared glances over ancient texts, in the way Kalen's scent would soften almost imperceptibly when he was near. The sterile steel would warm. The storm-charged earth would become richer, a promise of sanctuary. One evening, as they stood by a panoramic window overlooking the city, Kalen had reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from Elian's temple. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt of pure energy through Elian's entire body. The air crackled. The half-formed bond between them surged, a brilliant, blinding connection that demanded completion. It was a silent promise of union, of two halves of a whole finally clicking into place. Elian had felt a sense of rightness, so profound it was terrifying. In that moment, he would have given anything, accepted anything. But Kalen had pulled his hand back, his expression tight with control. "Not here," he had whispered, his voice rough. "Not like this." It was a promise of a future that Elian, in his diligent, quiet way, had then destroyed. He had stumbled upon the Council's encrypted communications by accident, a misfiled data ghost in the deep archives. He read their plans. They saw Kalen's imminent rise to the Ascendancy Council. They feared his unyielding integrity. They were searching for a weapon to use against him, a lever to control him. The reports from their agents were clinical. Subject Vance shows no personal attachments, no financial improprieties, no ideological weaknesses. He is clean. However, preliminary biological assessments suggest a high-potency alpha dynamic, unbonded. This represents a potential vulnerability. An omega of the correct compatibility could be used to exert significant influence. Elian's blood had run cold. They weren't just planning to use any omega. They were actively searching for one. And he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that the bond he shared with Kalen was a beacon. Once completed, it would register on the city's biometric network. It would make him a target, and through him, Kalen would become a puppet. His fierce independence, his incorruptible nature, the very things Elian admired most, would be chained. So he had made his choice. He would be a ghost. He would be the vulnerability that neutralized itself. The memory faded, leaving the bitter taste of the present in his mouth. The datapad chimed, a soft, insistent tone. A message from Lena, the black market tech who was his only lifeline. The text was stark, stripped of her usual cynical humor. "They're in the Warrens, full biosweeps. Scent analyzers are active. You have maybe an hour. The old transit tunnel, exit 4B. I'll meet you. An hour." His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. A pale, haunted face stared back. He was not the quiet archivist from the Athenaeum anymore. He was a loose end, a glitch in the system. And the system was closing in, guided by the cold, brilliant, and broken heart of the man he still, despite everything, loved. He grabbed his pack, the inhibitors, the few credits he had left, the phantom ache where the bond should be pulsed, sharp and violent, a warning and a lament. He had run from Kalen to save him. Now he had to run again, just to survive him. The air in the Bastion's command center was thick with the silent tension of 1,000 unfolding operations. Data flowed across the main view screen, a mesmerizing cascade of city schematics, drone feeds, and biometric data. Kalen stood at the center of it all, a still point in the hurricane of information. He was processing it all, his mind a quantum computer running 1,000,000 simulations at once. But his focus was narrowed to a single, impossibly small target. He watched the progress of the sweeps in the Gamma Warrens. The search teams moved in disciplined formations, their helmet-mounted sensors painting the subterranean labyrinth in shades of thermal and biological data. Red for alpha, blue for beta, soft gold for omega. The screen was a sea of red and blue. Gold was rare this deep in the undergrid. A new data point flared on his console. A ping from a public terminal in a sub-level marketplace, 2 kilometers from the primary search grid. A flagged communication, encrypted, but the source signature was one he had tagged weeks ago. Lena Core, a known data broker and system ghost with a history of providing untraceable identities and safe houses. A person of interest in his search for Elian. Kalen's eyes narrowed. The message was a ghost, its contents already wiped. But the destination signature, however briefly it existed, was logged. An abandoned transit tunnel. Exit 4B. It was a weak signal, a whisper in a storm, but it was more than he'd had in 21 days. "Marcus," he said, his voice cutting through the low hum of the command center. Marcus was at his side in an instant. "Director, divert Tactical Team 3. Target, abandoned transit tunnel, Sector Gamma 9, exit 4B. I want a silent approach. Non-lethal ordnance only." Kalen's gaze remained fixed on the schematic of the tunnels. "The asset is not to be harmed. That is my primary directive. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, sir," Marcus replied, but there was a flicker of something in his voice, hesitation, concern. "Sir, if I may, the Council is demanding a full report on our operational expenditures. They're threatening to revoke your discretionary authority." "Let them," Kalen said, a cold, dismissive wave of his hand. "Their threats are irrelevant noise. The mission parameters have not changed." He turned to face his commander, and for a moment, the mask of the director slipped. Marcus saw the raw exhaustion etched around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand as he gestured toward the screen. He saw the abyss that had opened up behind his leader's legendary control. "Find him, Marcus," Kalen repeated, his voice lower now, stripped of its official tone. It was not a command. It was a plea, disguised in the language of authority. "Just bring him back." Marcus held his gaze, and in that moment, he understood. This wasn't about a systemic vulnerability. It wasn't about security or order. This was about a man trying to reclaim a piece of his own soul. "I will, sir," Marcus said, his voice firm with a renewed sense of purpose. He turned and relayed the orders, his voice crisp and efficient, a perfect cog in the machine his director had built. Kalen turned back to the screen, his focus absolute. He brought up the schematics for the transit tunnel. It was an old, decaying piece of infrastructure predating the unification. Unstable, dangerous, a perfect place to hide, a perfect place to get trapped. He felt a cold spike of something that was almost fear. It was an illogical, inefficient emotion, one he had long ago purged from his operational mindset. But it was there, a corrosive agent eating at the edges of his control. The thought of Elian, alone and scared in the darkness of those tunnels, was a critical system error he could not ignore. He remembered Elian's fear of enclosed spaces, a quiet admission one evening in the vast, open halls of the Athenaeum. He had confessed to a childhood incident, being trapped in a service conduit. Kalen had listened, filing the data away, and had made a quiet, internal vow to never let him feel that kind of fear again. Now Kalen himself was the one driving him into the dark. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He was the monster Elian was fleeing from, the very architect of his fear. The thought was a paradox that his logic could not resolve. He had to maintain order, but his pursuit of Elian was creating chaos. He had to protect the city, but he was willing to sacrifice its liberties to find one person. He had to save Elian from this self-imposed exile, but his methods were terrorizing him. He was breaking his own protocols. He was becoming the very thing he had spent his life fighting, an agent of chaos, driven by an unpredictable, emotional variable. A new window opened on his private console. It was a direct, encrypted channel from a member of the Ascendancy Council, Elder Korvac. The message was brief. Director Vance, your actions have become erratic. Your focus is compromised. The Council is convening to discuss your fitness for command. Stand down, or we will relieve you. Kalen read the words, and a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the baring of teeth. They thought they could threaten him. They thought their power was absolute. They did not understand. He had built the system they now used to govern. He knew its every strength, its every weakness, and he was no longer playing their game. His only objective was Ilian. Everything else, the council, his career, the city itself, was now secondary. He sent a single encrypted command, not to his security forces, but to a dormant subroutine buried deep in the city's core operating system, a program of his own design, a failsafe known only to him. The lights in the command center flickered once. On the main screen, a dozen data streams showing council communications went dark. Marcus turned, his eyes wide. "Sir, we've lost contact with the council chambers." "They are no longer a relevant factor, Commander," Kalen said, his voice calm, absolute. He had cut the head off the snake. For now, he had just declared a silent, one-man coup, all for a single, missing Omega. He looked at Elian's face on the screen, the quiet archivist who had unraveled his perfectly ordered world. He was not just a variable anymore. He was the new prime directive. The air in the old transit tunnel was cold and dead. It smelled of rust, stagnant water, and a deep mineral scent of earth that had not seen the sun in a century. Elian moved through the oppressive darkness, a small hand lamp cutting a nervous, trembling beam through the gloom. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the corroded ceiling and the frantic, unsteady rhythm of his own breathing. Lena's instructions had been clear. Follow the main tunnel for 2 kilometers, then look for a maintenance ladder at marker 4B. It was supposed to lead to a drainage nexus that would get him to the city's outer wall. Freedom. But every shadow seemed to move. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep. His instincts were screaming. He was prey, and this was a hunter's territory. The inhibitors were wearing thin, the edges of his control beginning to fray. A low, persistent heat was building in his core, a dangerous warmth that made his skin feel too tight and his thoughts slow and hazy. With the heat came the scent. He could smell it on himself, a faint but distinct sweetness, the fragrance of panic and impending need. It was a homing beacon, a fatal vulnerability. He forced himself to move faster, his boots splashing in the shallow, grimy water that covered the tunnel floor. He thought of Kalen, not the hunter, but the man he had known. He remembered Kalen's hands, large and capable, tracing the lines of an ancient map on a data scroll. He had been so careful, so gentle, with the fragile artifact. It was a stark contrast to the power he wielded, this quiet reverence for the delicate things of the past. You see history as a weapon, Elian had told him once, a set of data to be analyzed for tactical advantage. Kalen had looked at him, his gaze intense. And you see it as a ghost story, a warning. Perhaps we are both right, Elian had replied. Perhaps it is a warning about men who see the world as a weapon. The memory was a sharp, painful sting. He had been warning Kalen and warning himself. He had seen the potential for this obsession, this single-minded pursuit in Kalen's systematic mind long before it was ever turned on him. He stumbled, his hand bracing against the cold, slimy wall of the tunnel. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a symptom of the encroaching heat. He needed to rest, just for a moment. He leaned against the wall, extinguishing his lamp to conserve its energy, and plunged himself into absolute blackness. It was a mistake. With the loss of sight, his other senses sharpened. The smell of his own scent seemed to amplify, filling the small space. The phantom ache of the broken bond, a constant companion, flared into a searing pain. And then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Not a drip. It was the soft, measured tread of combat boots on wet concrete, far down the tunnel behind him. They had found him. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the haze of his preheat. He scrambled for his lamp, his fingers fumbling with the switch. The beam flickered on, wild and uncontrolled. He started to run, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The footsteps behind him grew louder, faster, their rhythm calm and disciplined. They weren't rushing. They were merely closing the distance. He was a rabbit, and the wolves were behind him. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. The beam of his lamp caught something ahead, a rusted metal sign, barely legible, 4B. The ladder. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. He reached it, his hands grabbing the cold, rusted rungs. He started to climb, his movements clumsy with haste and exhaustion. He could hear them now, right below him. He didn't dare look down. He just climbed, pulling himself up into a narrower shaft, the darkness absolute once more. A voice, amplified and eerily calm, echoed up the shaft. Elian Thorne, by the authority of the Director of Civic Security, you are ordered to surrender. Do not make this more difficult. It wasn't Kalen's voice. It was one of his soldiers, cold, impersonal, efficient. Elian ignored it, his only focus the next rung, and the one after that. He reached the top, his hands finding a heavy grate. He pushed. It didn't budge, rusted shut. He pushed again, every ounce of his waning strength behind it. It groaned, but held fast, trapped. The beam of a powerful flashlight shot up the shaft, pinning him in its glare. There is nowhere to go, sir. Please. The director's orders were clear. You are not to be harmed. The voice was closer now, just below him. He could hear the soldier beginning to climb the ladder. Despair washed over him, a cold, heavy tide. It was over. He had run, and hidden, and fought, and it had all been for nothing. He sagged against the grate, his energy gone. The soldier reached his level, his face obscured by a tactical helmet. He did not grab Elian. He simply held the light on him, his posture non-threatening. Please, sir, come down. We can resolve this peacefully. Resolve this? How could this be resolved? Kalen would have him. He would be taken back to the Bastion, a prisoner in a gilded cage. The bond would be forced, a chain to bind him to the very man he had tried to free. The council would have their weapon. Kalen's career, his life, would be over. Everything he had sacrificed would be for nothing. No, he would not let that happen. He looked down past the soldier, into the deep black void of the shaft. It was a long way down, a fall from this height. It would be final. There would be no capture, no bond. Kalen would be safe. The thought was surprisingly calm. A final, logical solution to an unsolvable problem. He shifted his weight, preparing to let go of the ladder. "Don't," the soldier said, his voice suddenly sharp, urgent. He reached out, not to grab Elian, but to hold the ladder steady. "Don't do it. He would never forgive me. He would never forgive himself." The soldier reached up and removed his helmet. Elian stared. It was Marcus, Kalen's second-in-command. His face was grim, his expression etched with a profound weariness. "This has gone on long enough," Marcus said, his voice no longer that of a soldier, but of a man. "The director. He is not well, Elian. This hunt is destroying him. The city is on the verge of chaos, and he doesn't care. All he sees is you." Elian clung to the ladder, his knuckles white. "He can't see me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "If he finds me, the council will use me against him. They'll destroy him." Marcus shook his head, a look of grim irony on his face. "The council is no longer a factor. The director has neutralized them. He's locked them out of the system. He's seized control of everything. He's burning the world down, Elian. Not for power, for you." The words hit Elian with the force of a physical blow. Kalen had declared war on his own government. He had sacrificed his career, his principles, his entire life's work, not because of a threat to the city, but because of a threat to him. Elian had tried to save Kalen from a cage, and in doing so, had driven him to build a fortress around himself, with the entire city as his prisoner. The tragic, perfect irony of it was overwhelming. His sacrifice had not saved Kalen, it had unleashed him. "He needs you to stop him," Marcus said, his voice low and earnest. "No one else can. You're the only one who can reboot the system. Please, come back, not for the director, for Kalen." The name, spoken so plainly in the darkness, was a key turning in a lock deep inside Elian. Kalen, the man who loved dusty old scrolls, the man whose eyes held a galaxy of loneliness, the man who was now tearing the world apart in a desperate, misguided attempt to put himself back together. Elian's hands trembled. He looked from Marcus's pleading face to the darkness below, and then back again. His gambit had failed. His logic had been flawed. He had treated Kalen like a system to be manipulated, a problem to be solved. He had forgotten about the man. Slowly, painfully, he began to climb back down the ladder. The journey back to the surface was a silent, tense affair. Marcus and his team formed a protective cordon around Elian, their movements fluid and professional. They were not captors. They were escorts. The distinction was subtle but profound. They treated him not as a fugitive, but as something fragile and immensely valuable, an asset to be delivered. He was taken to a waiting transport, a sleek, unmarked vehicle that cut through the city's restricted zones with silent, effortless speed. The city that flashed past the armored windows was not the one he remembered. Checkpoints manned by heavily armed sentinels stood on every corner. The usual vibrant flow of traffic was choked to a trickle. The faces of the few citizens on the streets were tense, fearful. This was Kalen's city now, a city under martial law, not by decree, but by the quiet, suffocating implementation of security protocols. It was a masterpiece of control, beautiful and terrifying in its efficiency. The transport ascended, leaving the grimy undergrid behind, climbing toward the glittering spires of the elite sectors. Finally, the bastion came into view, a shard of black glass and steel that pierced the clouds, a monument to one man's will. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. He was being taken to the heart of the storm, to the eye of the hurricane, to Kalen. As they entered the bastion's private underground port, the air changed. The raw, organic smells of the city were replaced by the sterile, filtered air of Kalen's world. The scent of steel and winter was everywhere, a faint but pervasive ghost in the ventilation. It was Kalen's scent, but it was wrong. It was sharper, colder, with an edge of something acrid, like burning circuits. It was the smell of control pushed to its breaking point, of an alpha in distress. Marcus led him to a private elevator. "He is waiting for you," he said, his voice low. "In the Athenaeum." Elian's breath caught. Not the office, not a holding cell. The Athenaeum, their beginning. The building was scheduled for demolition, Elian stated, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The director halted the order 3 weeks ago," Marcus replied. "He declared it a site of historical significance. He has been spending his nights there, alone." The elevator doors opened onto the familiar, cavernous space. It was just as he remembered, yet utterly different. The engineered sunlight was gone, replaced by a dim, cold emergency lighting that cast long, distorted shadows. The air was still and cold, heavy with the smell of dust and Kalen's distressed scent. And in the center of the vast, circular room, where the central archive console used to be, Kalen stood waiting. He was not in his uniform. He wore a simple black tunic and trousers, the severe lines of the clothing doing nothing to hide the coiled tension in his body. He looked thinner, his face darker, the planes of his cheeks and jaw sharpened by exhaustion and stress. But his eyes were the same, the color of a winter sky, and they were fixed on Ilian with an intensity that burned. The soldiers, including Marcus, retreated silently, the heavy doors of the Athenaeum closing behind them with a soft, final thud. They were alone. The silence was a living thing, a chasm between them filled with 3 weeks of fear, obsession, and misunderstanding. "You ran," Kalen said. His voice was not accusatory. It was a flat statement of fact, devoid of emotion. Yet the words seemed to hang in the cold air, heavy with the weight of his pain. "I had to," Elian replied, his own voice trembling slightly. He took a hesitant step forward. "I did it to protect you." A flicker of something, disbelief, anger, confusion, crossed Kalen's face. "Protect me? From what? By erasing yourself? By severing the one connection that brought order to my world? You plunged my entire system into chaos, and you call it protection." He took a step toward Elian, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in. "I am the director of civic security. I am the architect of the most sophisticated defense network in the world. I protect this city. I protect my assets. I was meant to protect you, yet you presumed I was the one who needed saving." "It wasn't from a physical threat," Elian said, holding his ground, his voice gaining strength. "It was the council. I found their communications. They knew you were on the verge of ascendancy. They were looking for a weakness, a lever, a bonded Omega. They would have used me to control you, to chain you. I would have been the end of everything you built." He saw the flicker of understanding in Kalen's eyes, the cold logic of his statement penetrating the fog of instinct and betrayal. But it was quickly replaced by a deeper, more profound hurt. "So you made a tactical decision," Kalen said, his voice dangerously soft. "You assessed the variables, you calculated the risks, and you eliminated the primary liability, yourself. You treated our bond as a political inconvenience to be neutralized." "No," Elian whispered, shaking his head. "I treated it as something precious, something they could not be allowed to tarnish. I chose to lose you so that you would not lose yourself." "And what you see before you," Kalen said, gesturing to the empty, shadowed hall, to the city outside under lockdown. "Is this the man you saved? This is not me, Elian. This is a system error, a machine executing a flawed directive. Find the missing component, restore operational integrity. That is all I have been for 3 weeks, an algorithm of loss." He was closer now, only a few feet away. His scent was overwhelming, a storm of cold steel, ozone, and a deep, aching loneliness that called to the very core of Elian's being. The preheat, which had subsided in his fear, now surged back with a vengeance, ignited by the proximity of its alpha counterpart. A wave of heat and need washed through him, so powerful his knees felt weak. He saw Kalen's nostrils flare, his pupils dilating as he caught the sudden spike in Elian's scent. The alpha in him responded instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It was not a threat, it was a sound of pure, possessive recognition. "You are in heat," he stated, his voice rough, thick with instinct. The inhibitors failed. Elian couldn't speak. He could only nod, his body trembling with the effort of staying upright. All the logic, all the reasons, all the carefully constructed arguments dissolved in the face of this primal biological reality. He had run, and Kalen had hunted, and now here they were, the Alpha and the Omega, their bodies singing a song their minds had forgotten how to sing. Kalen closed the final distance between them. He did not touch him. Not yet. He simply stood before him, his presence an overwhelming force. "All of this," he said, his voice a low, pained whisper that was for Elian alone. "This entire city in chains, all of it was just a shout in the darkness, hoping you would hear. I broke my world to find you." Elian looked up into his eyes, and for the first time, he saw past the director, past the Alpha, and saw the man. Lost, terrified, and utterly, devastatingly alone. Without thinking, driven by an instinct deeper than reason, Elian reached out and laid his trembling hand on Kalen's chest, right over his heart. He could feel its frantic, unsteady rhythm beneath his palm. "I'm here," he whispered. "Kalen, I'm here now." The touch was a spark in a tinderbox. Kalen's control, stretched taut for 3 agonizing weeks, finally snapped. The moment Elian's hand made contact, a tremor went through Kalen's entire body. It was as if a circuit, long starved of power, had suddenly been reconnected. The raw, chaotic energy that had been driving him, the static noise of the broken bond, coalesced into a single, focused point. The Omega standing before him, his scent a dizzying symphony of submission and need. His own instincts, so long suppressed and sublimated into the cold logic of command, roared to the surface. The growl in his chest deepened, a possessive, primal sound that had no place in the sterile world he had built. He covered Elian's hand with his own, his fingers wrapping around it, holding it tight against his chest. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure data that his system had been craving. Elian was real. He was not a ghost. He was warm and solid, and he was here. "You feel it," Kalen breathed, his voice rough, his gaze locked on Elian's flushed face. "The heat. The bond. It is not a political liability, Elian. It is not a tactical weakness. It is gravity. It is the force that holds my universe together, and you tried to defy it. His other hand came up, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were afraid Elian might bolt again. He cupped Elian's jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin. Elian leaned into the touch, a soft, involuntary sound escaping his lips. The haze of the heat was thickening, making it difficult to think, to form the words he needed to say. All he knew was the overwhelming rightness of this touch, of this proximity. The phantom ache in his chest was gone, replaced by a vibrant, humming warmth that spread through his entire body. "I thought," Elian began, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was being logical, self-sacrificing." "There is no logic in self-amputation," Kalen countered, his voice raw with a pain that went beyond the primal. "You did not save me. You wounded me. You wounded us." He lowered his head, his forehead resting against Elian's. He inhaled deeply, drawing in the sweet, intoxicating scent of his Omega. It was a balm to his frayed nerves, the antidote to the poison of the last 3 weeks. The sharp edges of his distress began to soften, the scent of burning circuits replaced by the rich, earthy smell of a coming storm, finally ready to break. "They would have hurt you," Elian whispered, his eyes fluttering closed. "To get to me." "Let them try," Kalen murmured against his skin. "They would have discovered what it means to threaten the center of my world. I would have dismantled them piece by piece. I would have protected you. That is my function. That is my right." The arrogance in his words was absolute, yet it was not born of ego. It was born of a certainty so profound it was a law of nature. The alpha protects his omega. Everything else is secondary. The heat was becoming unbearable for Elian, a liquid fire pooling in his belly. He was losing himself to it, his body arching instinctively toward Kalen's, seeking friction, seeking release. "Kalen," he gasped, the name a plea. Kalen understood. He saw the struggle in Elian's eyes, the battle between his rational mind and the overwhelming tide of his biology. And he knew, in that moment, what he had to do. It was not about possession. It was not about command. It was about sanctuary. He gently disentangled himself, his hands moving to Elian's shoulders to steady him. The loss of contact was a physical blow, and Elian whimpered in protest. "Shh," Kalen soothed, his voice a low, calming rumble. "Not here. Not like this." The words were an echo of what he had said to Elian weeks ago, in a different world, under a different promise. He had meant them then, a promise of a proper courtship, of a union built on respect as well as instinct. He meant them now, for a different reason. He would not take Elian in a haze of heat and desperation, in the cold, dusty ruin of their past. The completion of their bond could not be an act of surrender to chaos. It had to be a choice, a deliberate, conscious rebuilding of what had been broken. "Your heat," Kalen said, his voice regaining some of its clinical precision, a familiar shield against the storm of emotion. "We need to manage it. The suppressants in your system have failed. A full heat, unbonded, will be dangerous for you." Elian could only nod, his body trembling violently. He was grateful for Kalen's hands on his shoulders, holding him upright. He was losing his grip on reality, the world narrowing to the scent of his alpha and the fire in his own veins. Kalen guided him toward a side room, one of the old archivist offices. It was Spartan, containing only a small cot and a terminal. Kalen had clearly been using it as his private refuge. He helped Elian lie down on the cot, his movements gentle, efficient. "I have medical supplies," Kalen said, his focus absolute. "Stronger suppressants. They will ease the symptoms, give you back your clarity. Then we will talk. We will decide what happens next. Together." Elian looked up at him, his vision blurring. He saw the conflict in Kalen's face, the raw, primal instinct of the alpha warring with the controlled, disciplined mind of the man. The alpha wanted to claim him, to sate the heat and seal the bond with the violent finality of nature. But the man Elian had fallen in love with, was fighting for him. He was fighting for Elian's choice, a wave of love so powerful it eclipsed even the heat washed through him. This was the man he had tried to save, the man who, even at the edge of his own control, was still trying to save him. "No," Elian whispered, his voice surprisingly firm. He reached up, his hand finding Kalen's. "No more suppressants." Kalen froze, his eyes widening. "Elian, you don't understand." "I do," Elian insisted, his gaze clear and lucid for a brief, startling moment. "No more running, no more hiding, no more neutralizing the variable. I am not a problem to be solved, Kalen. I am your Omega." The words hung in the air, a declaration and a surrender. He was choosing this. He was choosing him. He was choosing the bond, not as a weakness, but as their most profound strength. "The Council," Kalen began, the last bastion of his logic trying to assert itself. "The political ramifications. Will you dismantle them, piece by piece?" Elian asked, throwing Kalen's own words back at him. "Will you protect me?" A slow, profound change occurred in Kalen's expression. The conflict eased. The tension in his shoulders dissipated. He looked at the Omega on the cot, offering himself freely, not in a haze of instinct, but with the full weight of a conscious choice. He saw not a liability, but a partner, an anchor, his center. He lowered himself to his knees beside the cot, his movements filled with a reverence that Elian had only seen him display toward the most ancient and fragile of artifacts. He took Elian's hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "With my life," Kalen vowed, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name or control, or even want to. "With everything that I am." He then leaned forward and captured Elian's mouth in a kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was the closing of a circuit, the solving of an equation, the end of a hunt, and the beginning of everything. The storm had finally broken. The world dissolved into scent and sensation. The last vestiges of Elian's rational thought were swept away by the rising tide of his heat, but it was no longer a fire of panic and pain. It was a warm, welcoming sea, and Kalen was his anchor in it. The kiss deepened, Kalen's initial reverence giving way to the fierce, possessive hunger he had held in check for so long. It was a kiss of reclamation, a brutal and tender mapping of territory that had always been his. Elian met his passion with a desperate fervor of his own, his hands tangling in Kalen's hair, pulling him closer. The cold, dusty air of the Athenaeum became charged, thick with the intermingling scents of their arousal. Elian's sweet, rain-petal fragrance was darkening, ripening, a heady invitation that wrapped around Kalen's sharp, metallic scent of control, softening its edges, grounding it in something organic and real. Kalen broke the kiss, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. He pressed his face into the curve of Elian's neck, inhaling the potent scent at the gland there. A low, guttural sound of pure satisfaction rumbled in his chest. "Mine," he growled, The word a vibration against Elian's skin that resonated deep in his bones. It was not a statement of ownership, but of fact, a law of their shared universe. Yes, Elian breathed, his head falling back, exposing his throat in a gesture of absolute trust, absolute surrender. This was not a defeat. It was a victory. It was the end of the lonely, silent war he had been waging against himself, against his own nature. To be claimed was not to be caged. It was to be seen, to be known, to be finally, completely home. Kaelin's hands moved over him, stripping away the layers of his worn, travel-stained clothing with an urgent, practiced efficiency. His touch was a strange and intoxicating mixture of clinical precision and primal hunger. He was the director, analyzing a system, and the alpha, claiming his mate. Every touch was both a question and a command, and Elian's body answered without hesitation. When Elian was bare, Kaelin paused, his gaze sweeping over him. In the dim light, Elian felt exposed, vulnerable, but Kaelin's eyes held no judgment, only a profound, almost painful reverence. He looked at Elian as if he was seeing the solution to a problem he had not even known how to articulate. "You are a perfect design," Kaelin murmured, his voice thick with awe. It was the most romantic thing Elian had ever heard. It was Kaelin, translating the overwhelming, illogical beauty of this moment into the only language he truly understood. The language of systems, of logic, of flawless creation. Elian reached for him, his hands fumbling with the fastening of Kaelin's tunic. He needed the contact, the skin-on-skin reality of the man he had ached for. Kaelin helped him, shrugging out of his clothes until he too was bare. The cool air of the room washed over them, a stark contrast to the heat building between their bodies. Kaelin's body was a map of control and discipline, lean muscle and pale skin marked with the faint, silvery lines of old scars. Elian traced one on his ribs, a relic from a life he knew nothing about. Kaelin captured his hand, his grip firm. "They are irrelevant data," he said, understanding the unspoken question. "The past. You are the present. You are the future." He guided Elian's hand lower, placing it over his heart. "This is the only system that matters now." The bond, the beautiful, incandescent thing they had almost formed and then brutally severed, flared to life between them again. It was no longer a delicate thread of potential. It was a raging river of energy, demanding release, demanding completion. It was a physical presence in the room, a pressure against the skin, a hum in the air. Kaelin moved over him, settling his weight between Elian's parted thighs. He looked down into Elian's eyes, his own a stormy, turbulent grey. "There is no turning back from this," he said, his voice a low, serious rumble. It was the final protocol check, the last chance to abort the sequence. "I know," Elian whispered, his voice steady. "Sure. I'm not running anymore." That was all Kaelin needed to hear. He lowered his head, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin of Elian's neck, searching for the exact spot where instinct told him to mark his claim. Elian arched into him, his body slick with sweat, every nerve ending alive and screaming for completion. The world narrowed to this single, inevitable moment. There was no council, no city, no past, no future. There was only the Alpha and the Omega, in the ruins of their beginning, about to forge a new world. Then came the bite. It was a sharp, searing pain that was simultaneously the most profound pleasure Elian had ever known. It was a jolt of pure energy, of data transfer on a biological, spiritual level. He felt Kaelin's life, his strength, his control, his absolute devotion pouring into him. He cried out, a sound that was half pain, half ecstasy. At the same time, he felt the bond snap fully and finally into place. The phantom ache was gone, replaced by a radiant, unbreakable connection. He could feel Kalen in his mind, a steady, powerful presence. He felt the roaring tempest of the alpha's instincts, and beneath it, the deep, quiet calm of the man who was finally, irrevocably, anchored. Kalen soothed the new mark with his tongue, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of the bonding. He lifted his head, his eyes glowing with a faint, predatory light. He was complete. He was settled. He was home. He entered Elian in one slow, deliberate, impossibly deep thrust. Elian gasped, his body stretching, accommodating, welcoming him. It was not a violation. It was a perfect, final integration. Two systems becoming one. Kalen began to move, his rhythm steady, powerful, and sure. It was the rhythm of a heart that had found its beat, of a world that had found its axis. Elian wrapped his legs around Kalen's waist, meeting his every thrust, lost in a spiral of pleasure so intense it was almost unbearable. He could feel Kalen's pleasure through the bond, a feedback loop that amplified his own. He saw flashes of Kalen's thoughts, images of his own face, the scent of rain, the feel of his hand on Kalen's chest. He felt Kalen's relief, a tidal wave of it, the profound, soul-deep peace of a hunter whose search was finally over. The climax built between them, a supernova of energy. When it came, it was simultaneous, a shared, shattering release that left them both gasping, their bodies slick and trembling. In the aftermath, as their heartbeats slowly returned to normal, Kalen did not pull away. He collapsed onto Elian, his full weight a comforting, possessive anchor. He buried his face in Elian's hair, his breathing still ragged. Through the bond, Elian felt not just the lingering pleasure, but a wave of profound, overwhelming gratitude. It was a quiet, humbling emotion that he had never expected from the cold, controlled director. It was Kalen's. The sweeps are cancelled, Kalen murmured against his skin, the words spoken as if they were a vow. The checkpoints will be dismantled. The city will breathe again. Elian stroked his hair, his own body feeling boneless, replete. And the council? He asked, his voice soft. He felt Kalen's smile against his scalp. The council will be restructured. I have all the data I need to expose their corruption. They sought a lever to control me. They have inadvertently given me a weapon to dismantle them. The irony was not lost on Elian. In their attempt to control Kalen, they had given him the one thing that made him truly invincible. A reason to fight for something beyond abstract concepts of order and security. They had given him a home to protect. And us? Elian whispered. Kalen lifted his head, his winter sky eyes clear and calm for the first time in weeks. The storm was over. Us, he said, his voice resonating with the unshakable certainty of a prime directive, is a permanent state of operational integrity. We are the new system, and I will never let it crash again. He lowered his head and kissed Elian again, a soft, slow kiss of infinite promise in the quiet, dusty heart of their new world. The simulated dawn cast long, golden shafts of light through the high-arched windows of the Athenaeum. The dust motes, once symbols of neglect and decay, now danced in the light like tiny, glittering promises. Elian lay on the narrow cot, wrapped in Kalen's tunic, which was far too large for him, and smelled intoxicatingly of his alpha. Kalen sat in a chair he had pulled over, watching him, his gaze soft and unwavering. The city outside was stirring, but it was a different kind of movement than before. Through the bond, Elian could feel the residual tension in Kaelin's mind as he remotely monitored his city, but the frantic, obsessive edge was gone. It was replaced by a calm, focused oversight. The hunt was over. The rebuilding had begun. "Marcus is handling the council," Kaelin said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He is presenting them with a choice: resign or have their personal and political indiscretions made public. He is a very persuasive man." "You trust him," Elian stated. It wasn't a question. Implicitly, Kaelin confirmed. He saw the system was failing because its operator was compromised. He acted to correct the variable. He brought you back to me. His loyalty is not to my position, but to my purpose. Now, you are my purpose. The words should have sounded clinical, but they were imbued with a deep, resonant warmth that flowed between them through the bond. It was a constant, low-level hum of reassurance, of presence. The lonely silence that had defined both their lives was gone, filled by this quiet, permanent connection. Elian sat up, the tunic slipping from his shoulder. He looked around the vast, empty hall. What will happen to this place? Kaelin's eyes followed his gaze. I am reinstating its historical landmark status. It will be preserved. A reminder that the past is not just data to be archived, but a foundation upon which to build. He paused, his gaze returning to Elian. This is where my system first encountered the variable that would force its evolution. It is the most important site in the city. Elian smiled, a real, unburdened smile. You're a poet, Director. I am an alpha who has found his mate, Kaelin corrected gently. The experience appears to have upgraded my linguistic subroutines. The dry, almost humor was so unexpected that Elian laughed, a clear, bright sound that echoed in the cavernous space. He saw Kaelin's lips curve in a faint, answering smile. It transformed his severe face, and making him look younger, less burdened. Elian knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he might be one of the only people in the world who would ever see that smile. It was his, and his alone. He patted the space on the cot beside him. Kaelin rose and came to sit next to him, their bodies naturally slotting together, a perfect fit. Elian leaned his head against Kaelin's shoulder, closing his eyes. He felt safe, not just physically protected, but emotionally anchored in a way he had never imagined possible. The fear, the running, the desperate loneliness. It all seemed like a story from another lifetime. It won't be easy, Elian said softly, thinking of the future. The city, the politicians who remain, they will see me as your weakness. Then they will be operating on flawed intelligence, Kaelin replied, his arm wrapping around Elian, pulling him closer. You are not my weakness. You are my command center. My entire operational focus has shifted. It is no longer about maintaining a sterile, predictable order. It is about creating a world that is worthy of you. A world where you are not a secret to be hidden, but a truth to be celebrated. He tilted Elian's chin up, his gaze intense. I will not hide you, Elian. I will not allow you to hide yourself. We will face them together, the director and his bonded mate. Let them see what true strength looks like. Elian felt a surge of pride and love, so strong it was dizzying. This was the man he had seen glimpses of in the archives, the leader, the visionary, the protector. His sacrifice had been a mistake, born of fear and a misunderstanding of Kaelin's true nature. He hadn't needed Elian to step aside for him to be strong. He had needed Elian by his side to be complete. Okay, Elian whispered, the single word a vow of his own. Together. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the light change, feeling the city outside slowly, cautiously, returning to a new kind of normal. The oppressive blanket of surveillance was lifting, and the frantic energy of the hunt was being replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of a system that was once again functioning as it should. A new message pinged on Kalen's personal datapad, which sat on the floor beside them. He glanced at it. A single line of text from Marcus. They have tendered their resignations. All of them. The city is yours, Director. Kalen read the message, his expression unreadable. He did not look triumphant. He looked calm. He powered down the datapad and set it aside. The final piece of the old world had fallen away. What now? Elian asked. Kalen turned to him, his winter sky eyes holding a warmth that was brighter than the simulated dawn. Now, he said, we go home. He stood, pulling Elian to his feet. He picked up his discarded uniform from the floor, not to put it on, but to wrap it around Elian's shoulders, a gesture of care, of protection, of possession. My home, Kalen clarified, is no longer the penthouse at the Bastion. It is not a location. It is a state of being. It is wherever you are. He took Elian's hand, his fingers lacing through his. But for logistical purposes, the penthouse has a better shower and a supply of my clothes that will actually fit you. Elian laughed again, the sound full of relief and hope. He walked with Kalen toward the great doors of the Athenaeum, their clasped hands a symbol of the unbreakable bond between them. As they stepped out into the main concourse of the Bastion, into the beginning of their new life, Elian knew that the hunt was truly over. He was not a ghost anymore. He was not a fugitive. He was the most cherished and protected secret in a city of secrets, the beating heart of the man who commanded it all. And he was, finally, irrevocably, home. The rain had stopped. Outside the vast windows, the sky was clearing, and for the first time in weeks, the city did not look like a circuit board or a hunting ground. It looked like a promise.